G'day everyone, my name is Sam Gilchrist. I live in Coffs Harbour on the mid-north coast of New South Wales. As a part of the Daiwa Anglers Angler Talk program to try and give us something to entertain us during the current COVID-19 lockdown pandemic. I'm going to try and give everyone a couple of tips on how to chase snapper. Following in some big shoes after Phelpsy and his bass talk, Jacko and his pies and cod talk, and Chris Hickson, and he covered off on brim. So I'm going to do my absolute best to try and give you a few pointers on how to catch snapper more consistently and hopefully come across a couple of big ones. Okay, let's get stuck into the questions. We had some really good questions come through. A lot of them, a lot came through about which beard oil do I use. Snapper slime most of the time. We'll get stuck into the serious questions. First one's from Adam Ray. What's the best moon phase for chasing snapper on the north coast? I've fished with Adam a lot and he's never asked me this question, but I think it's the first quarter of the moon, first quarter holding water is by far to me the most productive moon phase. I don't like fishing when there's any moon at all in the daylight hours. If you can time it so you've got a moon set in the first hour of daylight, that's quite productive. But outside of that, definitely that first quarter. You can catch snapper on any phase of the moon, but if you have moon up during the day, particularly if it's pretty full, you're in for a hard day's fishing. You can still catch them, but you really have to work hard. The next question was, do I prefer a 7-inch or a 4 to 5-inch shad? One of my favourite colours and designs. Mostly fish 7-inch plastics. I'm a firm believer in nearly all types of the fishing that I do that big baits equate to big fish. And I'll never forget seeing a video from some underwater footage of snapper in New Zealand swallowing carwai, and these would have been kilo to kilo and a half fish, and just swallowing them whole like jelly beans. So a 7-inch plastic is certainly it's not a big meal for a snapper. My favourite colours are nearly by a mile pearl white, pearl watermelon, garlica, the old pepper prawn. Years ago, pumpkin seed when it was around, nuclear chicken. Yeah, they all work. It's what you believe in more than anything. If you pick up a plastic in any colour and you're confident that it's going to catch, more often than not it will. You can pick up a colour that you've caught with before, and for whatever reason you're not feeling it, you're not sure if it's going to work, then sometimes it won't. Sometimes it's you and not the colour that you use. The next question from Sam Blundell. When chasing reds in less than 15 metres of water, what jig head size and retrieve do you use? There's so many variables in that question that you need to consider. There's current, there's wind, the speed of your drift, which will both be influenced by the current and the wind. If you've got current against wind, you really need to select a jig head that I think, say in 15 metres of water, you're going to get most of your bites in that 3 to 10 metre range. So you don't want your plastic to fall like a stone. You want to be fishing it in front of the fish, if that makes sense. So you cast out and the plastic actually swims, and the action attracts a snapper out of a school to come and take that plastic. So I would probably start in that depth with a 1/4 ounce, again 5/0. If a quarter's too heavy for a shad, then you can go to a paddle tail or a prawn or a grub, and the action of the prawn legs or the paddle tail or the grub's tail will slow your fall rate, so you're fishing longer in the strike zone. Otherwise, you could go to a 6/, or if you're really motoring along, there's a lot of current, you could quite easily fish a 3/8 in that depth. Retrieve, I don't really retrieve as such. I fish my plastics for snapper very subtly, little tiny hops, long pauses, fish them very slow. But in saying that, I remember one day I was fishing with my dad in probably a similar depth, 15 metres, and he was whipping his rod really erratically with a pilchard coloured plastic on. And I remember looking at him going, "Look at this battler, he doesn't know what he's doing." And he outfished me that day, 5-1 or something. Like he, so mix up your retrieve. I've heard, I do a lot of top watering these days, and I've heard from people who've done a lot more of it than me that the best top water fishers are the guys that never complete the same retrieve twice. I think the same can be said for any style of fishing, and particularly with your plasticking for snapper. Figure out what the snapper want on the day and you'll catch them. How do you target snapper drifting with soft plastics? That probably starts with a lot of planning, and the planning begins around your weather forecast and your knowledge of the spots that you plan to fish, or you think the fish may be there, and what influence the weather patterns are going to have on that particular spot, whether that be your drifts. You might consider the edges of the reef, how the wind is going to push you along the reef, and where you want to hit where you've perhaps caught fish before. And then I would have, in my mind, for a morning, you might have 20 drifts pre-planned, and then you need to change them if the conditions don't present the way that you sort of anticipated they would. Do weather conditions play a part in catching snapper? I'd say definitely. Overcast conditions are, and I think it applies to most styles of fishing. Overcast conditions are my preferred, because I think the fish perhaps feel they can hunt a little bit more freely in low light conditions. And before a big change in the weather, say a big southerly change or a storm or some kind of drop in barometer or a big weather event such as a cyclone, or I think fish, and it's just my theory, I think fish feed up pre the weather event, because during very turbulent waters, or when the ocean's really stirred up, it could potentially be harder to feed, so they might go a few days without feeding that much, so they feed up before. And we've had some amazing bite windows where we've ducked out in the morning, we know a southerly change is coming at 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning, and that first hour it fires, then you got to get home, and you get bashed up travelling home, but it was worth the run. Nigel Darbs has asked, floating baits or bottom bashing? I would say floating baits every time, but if I'm going out to have a float line session or a bait session, I'll always have a big cut bait or a livey or a butterfly slimy or something on the bottom. But then float lining is by far one of the most productive and one of the most enjoyable forms of snapper fishing around. There's almost nothing better than anchoring up on your spot or spot locking, setting up a burley trail and sending baits out. It's a proper exhilarating way to fish, and it's harder to stop big fish, I think. Just the angles that you're fishing on, and fishing mostly with monofilament, there's a lot of stretch. The fish somewhat, the tables turn in their favour, whereas if you're soft plasticking and you do come across a proper one, you can always jump on the key and chase after him, and you convert a lot more fish on plastics, I think, than bait fishing. But if you're out for a feed, float lining is certainly one of the most productive ways to go about it. Harrison has asked a pretty cool question. How do you get bites after the sun is high? So after 9 or 10 a.m. onwards. I think I actually had looked before answering all these questions, and a lot of my biggest snapper have come well after 9 a.m. in the morning. And whether or not that's because the littler fish, say your 35 to 75 centimetre fish, are very, very active in the early hours of the morning and feeding quite ferociously, I think that you catch more of them, and it's harder to get to the big ones sometimes because they're not as active, they're not as, they won't squirt out and grab a bait and what have you. But later in the morning, when those fish slow down, the bigger ones, you can sit a plastic in front of them and convince them to eat it. I don't think I can't even think of any of the 90 centimetre plus fish that I've caught. None of them have come in those early light hours. Most of them are 10, 11, 12 and 2 o'clock in the afternoon. There seems to be an early morning bite window, I think, and then you always seem to get a bite around lunchtime, and then late in the afternoon. I really like for bait fishing, but not so much soft plasticking. So in answering the question, it's all persistence. Keep working the edges of your reef. I don't think there's much use in being in, say, 10 metres of water at 10 or 11 in the morning. That's when you might want to be in your 30 metres of water, or out in your 60s, perhaps micro jigging, even in 80 metres. I personally don't fish that deep really ever. For me, I'd be fishing big fish spots in 30 metres, 27 to 32 metres, and really working on those rubble beds, and yeah, you'll find big ones in that middle of the day period for sure. Sean Morgan asked, how do you slow pitch in 20 to 40 metres? To be honest, Sean, I haven't done a lot of slow pitching. From what I do understand of it, I mean, we have done it in 20, 40 and 60 metres. It's all about the equipment you're using and having the right tapered rod which imparts the action on the jig, and using your reel in a quarter turn, a half turn or a full turn to load the rod, and when the rod bounces back, it imparts the action on the jig. We've had mixed success. I know one local guy, Craig Cameron, he's an absolute freak on the jigs. I've not seen anyone do it better than him. But my brother and I have managed some nice snapper, and Kobe are up to sort of 16 and 17 kilos on jigs, but it's not something that I do a lot of, because personally I don't really enjoy it that much, just dropping straight up and down. I'd rather the caster plastic, snapper, smash it off the top, your braid cut through the line, and a little bit of shallow water mayhem is my preferred method. David Fan, he asked what tides are the best. I don't have a preferred tide, Dave. I think that any tide change is good, particularly for those 10 till 2 in the afternoon. If you've got a tide change in between there, work them specifically. There'll always be a bite window on a tide change, but as far as high low, run in, run out, I don't think it makes a lot of difference. just fish hard between the tide changes, but then when you see a tide change coming, or you know there's one coming, plan on where you want to be for that tide change to make the most of that bite window. Do you find snapper sit off the structure and on the sand? From Chris Dixon. Absolutely. I think that if you really want to become proficient at targeting big snapper, or consistent at catching big snapper, work the edges of your reef. I could be wrong, but in my experience, they're not. It's not that often they're up on the hard rock. They're out on this gravelly, rubbly stuff, and you look at dive videos such as the immersion videos, or some of the ones from the dive crew up in the sanctuary at Byron Bay, and it's very rare that the snapper are up on the hard rock. All the big schools of fish are out on those edges. So yeah, if you put your plastics on the edges, you'll catch them. Gav Harris has asked, what's the go-to rig in Coffs Harbour, and have I ever used or had any success using live squid? Go-to rig is the two that you see behind me, the soft plastic outfits. I have two rigged at any given time, most of the time with a different size jig head, and a different lure profile, so that if you're not feeling it with one, you can quickly change over to the other, or if you happen to get blown away or snagged or whatever, you've got one at your fingertips to pick up and have another cast. I've never used a live squid. I wish I had, but every squid I've caught off Coffs, which is hardly any, I've eaten it. I think that a well-presented squid anywhere in the world is an amazing bait, but here you could catch anything from monster kingfish to mulloway to trophy snapper. One of my favourite questions is, and it's something I really enjoy talking about actually, is what's the best tip for a beginner to target snapper in shallow water? I genuinely love, the fact that we as fishers can share a little bit of information, and you might see someone go out there and put in the effort themselves and succeed. And my answer to that question would be, make sure that your knots are all perfect in the first instance. The last thing that you really want to do is go to all the effort to perhaps buy the gear or hop on a boat or buy a boat or whatever. There's a lot of work that goes into being out on the water and plan a drift and come across a fish and have I suppose you call it a technical failure. Make sure that your equipment is up to the task. Be confident in what you're using. Confidence is an enormous thing in anything that we do, but fishing, I always harp on in the boat that if you believe something's going to work, it'll work. I don't know why that is, whether or not that resonates down the line, who knows, but if you think you're going to catch, more often than not you will. Be stealthy, give yourself the best chance when you're out on the water. Be mindful of what you're doing in the boat. Try not to drop things, try not to slam hatches, try to tread lightly. And I think one of the most important things is to think like a fish. If you can get in the water with a mask and snorkel and have a look at some of these fish that you're trying to chase and how fish behave and why they sit under washes, and think differently about what you're doing, and really, it's not just throwing a line in, it's not just luck, it's not there's an art to it, and if you can visualize what they're doing and then fish accordingly, I think you definitely catch more and more consistently. And the last question, well, there's two actually. A lad, Guinea Muscles, he asked, why does he only catch panties when he's got a snapper lead and a bait on the bottom, and why does he catch big fish on the floaters? Don't know exactly why, but perhaps the snapper are a little bit wary of the boat, particularly the bigger fish, and you need to get the bait away from the boat for them to feed. But you know, when I'm float lining, the majority of the good fish come on floaters, so I'd say that's the reason. Maybe if you're at anchor and you've got a bit of chop or a bit of boat movement or something, they're a little bit wary. I know when divers get in and see schools of snapper, they move straight away. So they're very, very cagey fish, and that could be the reason. And the actual final question from Sean, Nick Fishing: if you had to describe the perfect snapper spot day, how would you approach it? It'd be a little bit of breeze, maybe six knots of breeze, just so there's a ruffle on the top. Be blue water, but not clear. It's sort of that 8 to 10 meters, tops 15 meters visibility. Downhill current, which here means north-south. And I would be anchored on the northern side of whichever reef you choose to fish. In those conditions, particularly that watercolour, the snapper that you catch will come up lit up. Their fins will be bright blue, their eyeshadows bright blue, and you know they're active, they're excited, they're on the tube. We'd have a float line session at first light with baits on the bottom, floaters out the back. You'd catch a lot of 70 to 90 centimetre fish doing that. Let them keep one or two of the 70s, let the rest go. Then once that bite shuts down, pick up the anchor or pull up the lecky and start to drift that country that you've just burleyed and catch a couple of metre fives. It'd be amazing. Oh, I'm nowhere near a metre five yet, 96, but no, not a metre five. I hope that helps anyone who loves their snapper fishing.